You had something to say. Maybe it was an idea in a meeting, a question in a classroom, a dream you almost told someone out loud, but something stopped you. Not a wall, not a locked door. Something quieter than that, a feeling, sudden and cold, that the moment you opened your mouth, every eye in the room would turn toward you. And in those eyes, you would find something you weren't ready to face. So you stayed quiet, you kept it inside, and the moment passed. We've all been there, my friends. That invisible hand that pulls us back just before we step forward. But here's the question worth sitting with. Why does the thought of being judged feel more dangerous than failure itself? To understand why judgment frightens us so deeply, we have to go back. Not to childhood, not even to our own lifetime. We have to go back much further than that. For most of human history, people did not survive alone. We lived in small groups, tribes, clans, communities held together by cooperation and shared trust. Hunting required coordination. Shelter required effort from many hands. Raising children required the help of people around you. Survival was never a solo achievement. It was always a group project. And so the group itself became something sacred. Not just useful. Sacred, because without it, you were exposed. Without it, the cold was colder, the danger was closer, and the chances of making it through another season were dangerously small. This means that being accepted by the group was not simply a social comfort. It was a survival requirement, and being rejected, cast out, ignored, pushed to the edges, was not an emotional wound. It was a genuine threat to your life. Our brains learned this lesson deeply, so deeply that the neural pathways connected to social rejection overlap significantly with those connected to physical pain. This is not a metaphor. Studies in neuroscience have shown that the experience of being excluded activates the same regions of the brain as actual physical harm. When we feel cast out, the body registers something close to danger. Think about what that means for a moment. It means the fear of being judged is not weakness. It is not irrational sensitivity. It is an ancient warning system, one that was designed to keep you connected, accepted, and therefore alive. The problem, of course, is that we are no longer living in small tribes on open ground. We are no longer in situations where one moment of social rejection could mean being left behind to face the wilderness alone. But the brain does not update itself quickly. Evolution moves slowly, generation by generation, while the world we live in changes faster than our nervous systems can follow. So that ancient alarm, the one that once protected our ancestors from real exile, is still running inside us, still watching, still scanning every room we walk into for signs of disapproval, still measuring how others look at us, what their silence might mean, whether we are still safe inside the circle. A person raises their hand to speak in a meeting, and somewhere beneath the surface, the old system activates. Not because the room is dangerous, but because the brain remembers, in its oldest language, that being seen and found lacking once carried consequences too heavy to survive. The fear of judgment, then, did not begin with insecurity. It did not begin with low confidence or a difficult childhood. It began with something much older, a wiring so fundamental that it was passed down through thousands of generations simply because the people who had it were more likely to stay connected, stay protected, and stay alive. We inherited their fear along with everything else they left us, so we were born with the wiring. But the wiring alone does not explain everything, because somewhere between that ancient instinct and the adult who hesitates before sending a simple email, something happened. The fear did not stay as a raw survival reflex. It was shaped, refined, taught a new language, and that process began early, much earlier than most of us realize. When we are children, the world is enormous and we are very small. We understand almost nothing about how things work. So we watch the people around us for signals, a parent's expression, a teacher's tone, the reaction of other children when we do something unexpected. These signals become our first map of the world, our first answer to the question, what is acceptable here and what is not? And children are remarkably efficient at reading those signals. Research in developmental psychology suggests that by the age of 5, most children have already developed a strong awareness of how others perceive them. They begin to adjust their behavior, not just based on what they want, but based on what they believe others expect. The performing self begins to form very early. Over time, something subtle but significant happens. The external voices, the parent, the teacher, the classmate who laughed, begin to move inward. We absorb them. We internalize them so completely that we no longer need the actual person to be present. We carry them with us. We build, without realizing it, an imagined audience that travels everywhere we go. Psychologists sometimes call this the imaginary audience, the sense particularly strong in adolescence but never fully disappearing, that others are watching us, evaluating us, forming opinions about us at almost every moment. Even when we are completely alone, that audience can feel present. Even when no one is looking, we sometimes perform for the version of others that lives inside our own mind. Think of a teenager who spends 40 minutes choosing what to wear before school. Not because they are vain, but because somewhere inside they can already hear the comments that might come. They are dressing for an audience that is not yet assembled. They are defending themselves against a judgment that has not yet been made. This is not a phase that simply ends at 18. For many people, the internal audience only grows more sophisticated with age. It learns our specific fears. It speaks in the voices of people whose opinions once mattered to us, and it becomes so familiar that we stop noticing it is there at all. What began as an evolutionary instinct, stay connected, stay accepted, was then given a structure by the world we grew up in. Every correction, every comparison, every moment we were made to feel that love or belonging was slightly conditional added another layer to that internal voice. The fear of judgment by adulthood is no longer just an alarm system. It has become a habit of mind, a quiet automatic filter running beneath every decision, asking, before anything else, what will they think? Here's what no one tells you about the fear of being judged. It rarely announces itself loudly. It does not arrive as panic or paralysis. It does not stop you in a single dramatic moment and say, I am fear, and I am in control now. It works much more quietly than that. It works in the margins of your life, in the small, almost invisible decisions you make every single day without fully understanding why. You don't submit the application because the timing doesn't feel right yet. You don't share the idea because the room doesn't seem open to it today. You don't start the project because you need to learn a little more first. You don't speak because someone else probably said it better already. Each reason sounds perfectly logical in isolation. And that is exactly what makes this fear so difficult to see clearly. It is a master of disguise. It dresses itself in the language of practicality, humility, patience, and preparation, until you can no longer tell the difference between genuine wisdom and quiet avoidance. But beneath the reasonable-sounding excuses, something else is happening. A life is being edited, not all at once, not in ways that are easy to measure, but slowly, chapter by chapter. The story of what you are willing to try grows narrower. The circle of what feels safe to attempt becomes smaller. And one day you may look back and realize that many of the distances between you and the life you imagined were never really about ability or timing or readiness at all. They were about the weight of imagined eyes. Consider someone who has a genuine talent for writing. They fill private notebooks for years. The words come easily when no one is watching. But the moment they imagine those words being read, being evaluated, being found ordinary, being met with indifference or quiet mockery, something tightens. The notebook stays closed, the work stays hidden, and the talent, real as it is, never travels further than the space between their hands and the page. What was lost there? Not just a piece of writing. Something larger, a version of themselves that never got to exist fully in the world. This is the hidden cost of the fear of judgment. Not the big, obvious failures we never attempt, but the quieter losses. The conversations never started. The relationships never deepened. The versions of ourselves never expressed. Because we decided, before anyone else had the chance to respond, that the verdict was already in. And here is the cruelest part of all this, my friends. The judgment we fear most is rarely delivered. Most people around us are far too occupied with their own internal audiences to spend significant time evaluating ours. The devastating review we imagined, the collective disappointment we prepare for, more often than not, it simply never comes. We suffer the sentence before the trial has even begun. The fear does not just cost us specific opportunities. It costs us something more fundamental. The experience of being fully present in our own lives, making choices from a place of genuine desire rather than constant preemptive defense against opinions that may never even be formed. That is not caution. That is not wisdom. That is a life lived at a careful, protected distance from itself. If the fear of judgment has always been part of us, something has changed in recent years. Something significant. The fear itself is not new, but the conditions surrounding it have shifted in ways that make it harder to escape, harder to rest from, and harder to even recognize as unusual anymore. For most of human history, the audience we performed for was limited. It was the people in your village, your workplace, your immediate community. The number of people who could observe you, evaluate you, and form opinions about you on any given day was relatively small. The circle of judgment had edges. You could step outside it. You could go home, close the door, and simply not be watched for a while. That boundary no longer exists in the same way. The average person now spends roughly 6 to 7 hours each day looking at screens, and a significant portion of that time involves some form of social visibility. Posting, reacting, being seen, watching others be seen. The architecture of modern digital life is built, almost entirely, around the performance of self. Every caption is a small audition. Every photo a quiet argument for your own value. Every moment of silence on a platform can feel, after a while, like a kind of invisibility. And invisibility, to that ancient part of us, still carries the old unease. What this has created is something new in human experience. A condition where judgment is no longer occasional. It is ambient. It runs in the background of daily life the way traffic noise runs in the background of a city. Present so consistently that we stop registering it as unusual even as it slowly shapes the way we think, speak, and decide. And crucially, we have begun to internalize this condition as normal. Young people growing up today have never known a world without public metrics attached to self-expression, a number of people who approved of your thought, the ratio of those who engaged versus those who passed silently by. Approval has been given a number, and that number updates in real time. A person posts something genuine, a thought they actually had, an image that actually meant something to them, and then spends the next several hours checking whether the world confirmed that it was worth sharing, not because they are unusually insecure, but because the system they are operating inside was designed, with great precision, to make that checking feel natural and necessary. The result is a generation, and honestly, people of all ages, who have become extraordinarily skilled at anticipating judgment before it arrives, at pre-editing themselves, at softening, adjusting, and sometimes erasing the most honest parts of their expression before anyone else even has the chance to respond. We have normalized a level of self-monitoring that would have seemed exhausting to previous generations, and because everyone around us is doing the same thing, it no longer feels like a burden. It feels like simply how life works now. But living inside a system does not mean the system is not costing us something. The noise of constant evaluation does not just affect what we share, it seeps inward. It begins to shape what we allow ourselves to think, feel, and want in private, when no one is watching at all. That is perhaps the quietest damage of all. So where does this leave us, my friends? We have traced this fear from its oldest roots, the survival instinct of creatures who needed each other to stay alive. We have watched it take shape through childhood, through the voices we absorbed and made our own. We have felt its quiet cost in the lives we edit before we even begin to live them. And we have seen how the modern world has turned what was once an occasional weight into something we carry constantly, without question. But I want to sit with something different now. Not a solution, not a list of steps toward confidence. Something quieter than that. A question worth asking is this: what are we actually afraid of when we are afraid of being judged? On the surface, we might say we are afraid of criticism, of failure made visible, of looking foolish in front of others. And those things are real. But underneath them, if we are honest, the fear tends to point towards something more personal than that. We are afraid that if someone sees us clearly, sees us try and stumble, sees us care deeply and fall short, sees the gap between who we are and who we wish we were, they will conclude that we are not enough, that the truest version of us, unpolished and uncertain, is somehow less worthy of belonging than the carefully managed version we present. That is the core of it. Not judgment itself, but what we believe judgment reveals. And here's where something important begins to shift. Because the version of yourself you are protecting so carefully, the one you keep just out of reach of other people's eyes, is also the version you never fully get to live. The protection and the limitation are the same thing. The wall that keeps criticism out also keeps genuine connection from coming in. You cannot be truly seen only in the places where you are certain you look good. That is not being seen. That is being approved of. And approval, however pleasant, is not the same as belonging. There is a kind of courage that has nothing to do with the absence of fear. It is not the courage of someone who no longer worries what others think. That person is rare and perhaps not entirely trustworthy. Real courage, the quieter kind, belongs to the person who feels the pull of that ancient alarm, who hears the internal audience begin its commentary and chooses, gently, to act anyway, not because the outcome is guaranteed, but because the alternative, a life lived entirely inside the safe perimeter of other people's imagined opinions, is its own kind of loss. The imperfect thing created, the honest question asked, the slightly trembling hand that raised itself anyway. These are not small things. They are evidence of a person still in motion, still willing to be seen, even imperfectly, still choosing participation over the cold safety of the sidelines. We will not always get it right. We will sometimes be judged, and the judgment will sometimes sting. That is real, and it deserves to be acknowledged. But a life in which we are occasionally genuinely seen in our effort, in our honesty, in our very ordinary humanity, is a fuller life than one spent perfectly hidden. The fear of judgment is ancient. It is understandable. In many ways, it is even kind, a reminder of how much we value connection, how deeply we want to matter to the people around us. But it was never meant to be the one doing the driving. You were. Until next time, my friends, sleep well and stay curious.